You tell yourself it's just an experiment. You wake up, you look at your phone, and you decide that today you are not going to be the one to say good morning. You're not going to send the funny video. You're not going to ask how their big meeting went. You just want to see if the bridge still exists when you stop building it. And then the hours pass. The hours turn into a day. The day turns into a weekend. Honestly, it's one of the most nauseating feelings in the modern social experience. You're sitting there, staring at a silent screen, realizing that a relationship you thought was mutual was actually entirely subsidized by your effort. If you don't start the engine, the car doesn't move. The silence stretches out, filling up your living room, creeping into your commute, sitting heavy in your chest while you try to focus on work. In 1961, a sociologist named George Homans developed something called equity theory. He found that human beings possess a deep, almost subconscious ledger for reciprocity. We are constantly tracking the emotional weight of our relationships. When we stop texting first, we aren't trying to be malicious. We're running a diagnostic test. We're checking the ledger to see if the other person is actually invested, or if they're just passively consuming our attention. You stop typing just to see if they'll notice your absence. You know exactly what this looks like. You open the chat thread and scroll up. You see a wall of your messages on one side of the screen and short, delayed, one-word responses on the other. You realize you've been interviewing them for months. You ask the questions. You carry the dead weight of the dialogue. You orchestrate the plans just to keep them around. You're the social glue, and you are completely dried out. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Are you actually friends, or are you just a convenient distraction when they're bored? But here's the twist. This isn't just about keeping score. The silence that follows your experiment physically hurts. In 1996, researchers Downey and Feldman mapped out the rejection sensitivity model. They looked at what happens to the human brain when we anticipate being ignored by people we value. When you stop reaching out and they don't fill the gap, your brain doesn't just process it as them being busy. It processes the silence as an active, intentional rejection. It feels like proof that you never mattered at all. The delayed response, or the complete lack of one, triggers a massive internal alarm system. You start replaying every interaction, wondering if you were always just an annoyance to them. Some people optimize for constant superficial connection. Others optimize for emotional equity. Society looks at you retreating and calls you dramatic. They say you're cutting people off too easily or putting walls up over nothing. They don't see the months of quiet exhaustion that led to this exact moment. You aren't putting walls up to keep people out. You're taking your energy back because you're tired of renting space in someone else's life. See, you are playing a completely different game. You're optimizing for peace. You would rather sit alone in an empty room than stand in a crowded room wondering if anyone actually wants you there. A connection shouldn't feel like a part-time job. If they wanted to talk to you, they would. Those two thoughts loop in your head while you stare at the read receipt. I still don't fully get why this specific type of grief is so hard to shake. Losing a friend in a massive blowout argument makes sense. There's an ending, there's a reason, but the slow fade, watching someone drift away simply because you stopped pulling them closer, that leaves a completely different kind of scar. It makes you question every memory you built together. It makes you wonder if they were ever really walking beside you, or if you were just dragging them along. But there's a second layer to this, and it's the part nobody wants to admit. We have built an entire culture around the convenience of ignoring each other. Recent research by Chan and Liu explored how we use texting as a mediated affordance for support. That's just a polite way of saying the screen is a shield. When the emotional demands of a relationship feel unequal, avoidant people use the distance of the phone to regain control. They drop the conversation because managing your expectations feels like too much work for them. They like the idea of you, but they don't want the responsibility of maintaining you. Yeah, but what if they are just busy? What if they're overwhelmed with work or stressed out or just bad at texting? We all tell ourselves that lie. We excuse their absence because facing their indifference is too painful. We pretend they're just bad at their phones, even though we watch them text other people while we're hanging out. You know the truth. People make time for what they value. You aren't demanding endless attention, you're just asking for the bare minimum of reciprocal human decency. And here's the most frustrating part: the breadcrumbs. Just when you finally make peace with letting them go, they send a random meme or they reply to your story with a single fire emoji. They do just enough to reset the clock, throwing you a tiny crumb of attention to keep you on the hook. It's infuriating. It proves they're alive, they have their phone and they know how to use it. They just don't want to engage in a real conversation. You feel your heart jump for a second, thinking they finally remembered you exist, but then the realization hits. This isn't a conversation, this is maintenance. They're doing the absolute minimum required to keep you as an option. So you make the hardest choice. You archive the chat, you mute their stories, you stop checking to see if they're online. You force yourself to let the silence sit there day after day until the urge to double text finally burns itself out. It's a lonely transition. You start shrinking your circle. You stop inviting 10 people to dinner and you start focusing on the 3 who actually show up without needing a reminder. This is the hidden cost of protecting your bandwidth. The reciprocity test always shrinks your world. You let the casual acquaintances fade away without guilt because you realize you only have enough fuel for the people who are willing to drive halfway. Look, it's not a flaw in your character that you want to be pursued sometimes. It's a fundamental human need to know that your absence would be felt. You are just exhausted from being the only one holding the heavy end of the couch. When you stop texting first, you're forcing the relationship to stand on its own 2 feet. And if it collapses the second you let go, it was never really standing at all. It was just leaning on you. You aren't cold, you aren't passive-aggressive, you're simply refusing to participate in a dynamic where your effort is the only currency keeping you both out of debt. That slow fade we talked about never really loses its sting. You will always wonder if there was some magic combination of words you could have sent to make them care as much as you did. But the truth is, no amount of your effort can manufacture mutual respect. Stepping back and letting the silence answer your questions is incredibly painful, but it's also the most honest thing you can do for yourself. You aren't building walls to hide from the world. You're just redefining your boundaries so you can safely let the right people inside. It means you're finally treating your own energy like a finite resource instead of an endless charity. The grief of losing them is real, but the relief of putting down the weight is even realer. Are you mourning the loss of a friend or just the illusion that they were one? Leave it right there. Subscribe if you want to keep untangling these thoughts with me.